Hello, I'm Niall Brolchain, and I'm here to talk about the Peatland Policy Webinar on the 29th of October 2020, organised by the Care Peat project and supported by National University of Ireland Galway and the National Parks and Wildlife Service. So just to give a bit of context to this, peatland is hugely important in terms of carbon emissions in the world, because roughly 5% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from degraded peatlands across the globe. Peatlands are hold about 33% of all soil carbon, and yet at the same time they only cover roughly about 3% of the land area. However, in Ireland the figure is about 20% of the land area is peatland, and that means that there's considerably bigger impact in terms of Ireland and our carbon emissions. And the great news is we know that simply by restoring and re-wetting the peatlands, because a lot of them have been drained, we can actually enormously reduce our carbon emissions from degraded peatlands. So it's very important we do that. And just to put it in a little bit of global context, I mean, people talk about things like aviation and shipping, but in fact restoration of peatlands is more important necessarily than, stopping all the planes flying and preventing the ships from traveling around the sea. So that's something that we can reasonably sort of expect to do over the next number of years, and the European Commission believes it's possible to reduce to net zero carbon in the whole land use area by roughly 2035. And in terms of land use, peatlands are the most important ecosystem on the planet. They roughly hold 4 times as much soil carbon as tropical rainforest, for example, and about twice as much as giant coniferous forests. So just a silly back at the envelope calculation to put things again in context, in an Irish context, roughly every 2 weeks we emit as much weight as the whole population of people of Ireland in terms of CO2. So there's just from degraded peatlands, that is, and there's huge amounts of CO2 going into the atmosphere from degraded peatlands every single week, and it's really something that needs to be brought to heel. At the webinar we're looking at 3 things, I suppose. We're looking at barriers, we're looking at enablers, and we're looking at policy gaps in terms of peatland restoration. Barriers, examples would be legislative barriers or institutional, technical, capacity barriers. Is there enough? Are there enough skilled practitioners to restore peatlands? Are there people with experience to do that? There are financial barriers. There's legal barriers. Do we enforce? Do we stop people from exploiting peatland in a big way? The answer is we don't really. How do we do that? And who does that? That's open to question. In terms of enablers, we've recently passed a climate bill, which is very important, and there is a lot of restoration work going on at the moment, led by the National Parks and Wildlife Services and Board Namona in particular. But there's a lot of private individuals, there's a lot of good projects going on around the country, and there's a lot of different enablers out there. It's important that we get the financial enablers right to make sure that it happens in a very big way. In terms of policy gaps, there's lots of different policy areas. We're hoping to hear from lots of different people as part of the workshop. What are the policy gaps in Ireland to enable peatland restoration to happen? Certainly it would seem obvious that we need to have an up-to-date national peatland strategy. The existing one is very good, but it's perhaps it needs to be reinforced or brought to bear. And I'd certainly like to see things like polluticulture, which is just to the fore in terms of the Common Agricultural Policy. There's been a lot of discussion around it, and we're basically talking about wetland farming on peatlands. So polluticulture is a word that we're going to hear a lot more of in the coming years, I believe. And the project that we're involved with at the moment is fantastic, specifically restoring the peatland at Clonecrow Bog, and there's just a few pictures here in relation to the wildlife that's sort of coming back onto the bog with restoration. And the most important thing, of course, is that the water is coming back onto the site. The carbon is certainly reducing in terms of the emissions, and we should see it turning back into a fantastic ecosystem over the coming years. And that really is what peatland restoration is about, restoring things to their natural form in the way that David Attenborough has recently called for. We have a big chance right now to do a lot of good in terms of our ecosystems, and it is now, we're now going into the United Nations decade of restoration, of ecosystem restoration, and certainly I hope that Ireland is very much going to play its part in that. Thank you.